Yo, what is going on, guys? SMH Super Mario Hoops back with some more hoops, and today we are hopping right back into my top 50 list in NBA history. Today we got the logo, also known as Jerry West. So where do I got Jerry West all time? I got him ranked at number 12. Now before we hop into Jerry West, gonna need you guys to hit the like button, subscribe, notification bell as well, would really appreciate that, and then feel free to comment your thoughts down below on this video or the list as a whole. But without further ado, let's get into Jerry West. Now, over his career, Jerry West was a 14-time NBA All-Star every year from 1961 until 1974. This was also every year of his NBA career, and he has the most consecutive seasons without missing the All-Star game of anyone in NBA history. He also is a 10-time All-NBA first-team member in 1962 until 1967, and then also from 1970 until 1973, and those 2 years in between, he was All-NBA second-team twice in 1968 and 1969. He was also a 5-time member of the All-Defensive teams. In 1970 to 1973, he was first-team All-Defensive, and he was All-Defensive second-team in 1969. Now, that's when the award actually became a thing, so he couldn't earn any other honors prior to that. He might even have more. In terms of scoring championships, he has one to his name. In 1970, he took home the scoring crown, took home the assist leader crown in 1972, and also in that 1972 season, he was an NBA champion. And weirdly enough, in a year he didn't win the championship, he was the finals MVP in 1969. Now, in terms of MVP shares, 10 times he's received votes over his career, 8 times in which he was a top 5 finisher, and he was even a 4-time runner-up. This is in 1966, 1970, 1971, and 1972. However, the first year was arguably Wilt Chamberlain's most successful and best version of himself. I mean, yes, I realize in 1962 he averaged like 50 and 25 a game, but I believe that Wilt on the 76ers was the best version of himself. In 1971 was the year when Kareem and Oscar kind of dominated the league together, and in 1972 West received a decent share, but he also had a teammate in Wilt Chamberlain who finished in the top 3 right behind him as well. The next highest Bucks player that year was Oscar Robertson, and Kareem won the award, and Oscar only received one first place vote as the injury bug kind of stuck with him most of that season as well as the playoffs. If you were to argue a year where Jerry West deserved to win and didn't, I mean, your best bet is probably 1970 when Willis Reed won the award. And it was a close result. I mean, Reed took home 64.3% of the total share, as West took 59% of the total share of possible points. Reed also had 61 first place votes to West's 51, but West was a better scorer, passer, more efficient, and higher win shares that year. But the Knicks were a better team. Reed was easily a better rebounder, and most people don't realize this, but if the Defensive Player of the Year award existed back then Willis Reed would have become the first player ever to be a regular season MVP, a Defensive Player of the Year, and a Finals MVP because he was that dominant in that season. And another argument against West is, believe it or not, Willis Reed's biggest kryptonite, and that's durability. Reed actually played more games than West in this season. So while I can understand the argument for the logo, I would still lean toward Willis Reed personally. However, West is still the best player in NBA history to never win the MVP. In terms of some all-time stat rankings, his 27 points per game puts him 4th all-time, a 22.9 PER puts him 27th all-time, 124.6 offensive win shares puts him 11th all-time, a .213 win share per 48 rating puts him 15th in NBA history, and 7,160 made free throws is 8th of all time. And he also led the league in true shooting percentage for 2 seasons and is probably one of the 3 most efficient players prior to the 3-point era. And if a 3-point line had existed, I mean, it would have raised his efficiency even more. Let's take the average point guard in terms of 3-point percentage and attempts last year, such as Kobe White. I mean, White made about 2.4 3-pointers a game on about 6.6 attempts per game last year, and still even shot a little bit below 36%. So that's kind of a hair below average. It's not to be too unfair with this comparison. But let's say West shot the same amount of field goal attempts per game, but instead 6.6 of them each night was a 3-point shot. His efficiency would jump from 55% true shooting for his career to 59.71%. And remember, this is with a slightly below average comparison. I mean, West was a top 3 shooter for his own era and prior to the defensive 3-second violation rule. So if you're able to raise it by just another percent, he would sit at about 61% true shooting for his career career, which is about top 15 all time and right on the level of another player like James Harden. But I don't think people realize this in these comparisons. But anyways, let's move on to the NBA playoffs for the logo. Much like the regular season, West is 4th all time in playoff scoring with 29.1 points per game, only behind Michael Jordan, Allen Iverson, and Kevin Durant. However, when it comes to the playoffs, West is relatively on par with his regular season. I mean, his scoring output decreases along with his PER. His efficiency, his assist outputs, his rebounding outputs, they all kind of drop. West did lead the league in playoff points per game on 4 different occasions in 1965, 1966, 1968, and 1969. The first in which he averaged over 40 points per game as he made it to the finals. And now remember, back then it was only 2 series before making the finals, but it's still kind of incredible. He averaged 20 points per game in 25 of 28 playoff series, 25 points per game in 19 of 28 playoff series, 30 points per game in 13 of 28 series, and in that first round series in 1965 against Walt Bellamy's Baltimore Bullets, he averaged 46.3 points per game in a 6-game series. And it's not like he just had like some one flukish game. He dropped 52 points in game 2, but every other game this series, he scored over 40 points per game. And I mean, that's pretty dominant. Now, I could spotlight each NBA Finals for Jerry West, but that's simply going to take too long to figure out how great he was essentially in all of them. So I figured we could kind of simplify it. He has the 4th highest point per game average in Finals history of 30.5 points per game, behind only Rick Barry, Michael Jordan, and Kevin Durant. And even though he made the Finals 9 times, he only played 2 opponents in the Celtics for 6 years and the Knicks for 3. His final stats against the Celtics across 38 games are 33 points per game, 5.7 rebounds a game, 4.9 assists per game, about 48% from the field and 84% from the free throw line, which is good for 55% true shooting. And really wasn't that inefficient in any of them except maybe 1965. However, they didn't have Elgin Baylor because he was sidelined this series, although of course Baylor did do most of the work during the 1962 and 1963 finals. In 66 and 68, both of them were kind of a 1A, 1B type of duo, but in 1969, West was clearly the number 1 while Baylor was the number 2. West in these finals averaged about 38 points per game, 4.7 rebounds, 7.4 assists, 49% from the field and 84% from the free throw line. And even though they lost in 7 games, West put up a 42-point triple-double, which to this day is the only 40-point triple-double in a Game 7 in NBA playoff history, let alone the finals. And along with James Worthy in 1988 and LeBron in 2016, it's only one of 3 triple-doubles in Game 7 of the NBA Finals. And West was so good that he even earned the Finals MVP honors, despite his team losing the series, being the only player to ever do so, even to this day. When it comes to the Knicks series, there are some positive signs, but a lot of negatives as well. In 1970, even though Willis Reed got hurt and it seemed like everything was falling off a cliff for the Knicks, he tried to come back for Game 7, and while it was inspirational, he didn't contribute much. However, even with Reed so intensely limited, Walt Frazier had the biggest game of the day. More points than West, more rebounds than West, more assists than West, made more shots than West, he made more free throws than West, he was more efficient than West, he had less fouls than West, and ultimately won the game, unlike West. You see, this is kind of heartbreaking because up to this point, Jerry West had no rings, no MVPs, and kind of needed this moment. And while he was decent, he wasn't great, and he needed to be. I mean, Walt Frazier was great, and as a result, his team won. And in 1972, the Lakers would get revenge. However, it should be noted that this was ironically West's worst final series of his career, possibly his worst playoff series too. Walt Frazier had him in jail, and West averaged 19.8 points per game, 8.8 assists per game, 4 rebounds on 32.5% from the field and 79% from the free throw line, and shot awful in the closeout, all on a season where, remember, he was the MVP runner-up and the highest placed voter on the team. This should have been his moment, but instead it was Will Chamberlain's. Gail Goodrich and Happy Hairston outplayed him as well, and one could argue Jim McMillan did too. In 1973, his individual play in the finals would be much better. Unfortunately for him, so were the Knicks. So much so that instead of a Game 7 like 1970, this one only went to 5. And he certainly wasn't better than Goodrich or Wilt, and maybe even Jim McMillan again. And while West was a little bit more efficient this series, he still wasn't efficient by his own standards. In his last year of his career, he kind of had a lot of injuries, so it's hard to make much out of that. But when it comes comes to Jerry West all time, I would still say he is underrated. I've kind of been on the fence with properly rated with some of the most recent lists I've seen. I know some people are mad I have him ranked above Bill Russell, but it's no secret that he is one of several players that consistently outplayed him when they matched up in the playoffs. Russell's a better defender, but West's offensive gap is much bigger. In the later years, he had his final struggles, but he's still arguably a top 5 finals player in NBA history, along with arguably being a top 5 scorer of all time, for sure top 10 at a minimum. A few things I didn't really dive into much is that, one, while Bill had many circumstances where he wasn't that go-to guy, West did have a few as well. I mean, I would say maybe the late 60s and 1970 were the times where he was the clear-cut number one, which is only about 4 or 5 years. He had those 1A, 1B seasons with Elgin Baylor during that time as well, and years prior he was kind of Baylor's sidekick. And in the later years he had that success in the regular season, but his playoff firepower dwindled. And the second thing is durability. I know technology back then is kind of laughable to now, but it doesn't simplify the fact that West played less than 70 games for over half the seasons in his career, and had multiple under 60 games in a season, and he never played over 80 games in a season, and his injuries were even a problem in the playoffs, such as 1967, 1971, and 1974. So West certainly was very talented, in my opinion a top 3 talent of this era, and while this stuff may fall against him, he still does appear underrated. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think about Jerry West. I mean, after all, he is the logo, and I think that he's done enough to warrant being the logo because he's one of the greatest players ever. But I think that's going to do it for me. Thank you guys for watching, and I think I'm going to leave it now as it is. So yeah, I'm out. Peace.